If you love staying at home, the world very quickly finds an explanation for you. Boring, lazy, everything is clear about them. As if a love for quiet were a character defect. As if you do not want to constantly go somewhere, meet someone, and be somewhere, it means you are not living fully. We live in an era that almost worships movement. Your calendar is supposed to be full, your evenings are supposed to be booked, your weekends are supposed to be real. And if you say that you just want to stay at home, it sounds almost like a confession of weakness, almost like saying, I give up. In our cultural imagination, a good life is a life where you are always somewhere, where there are meetings, trips, people, events, stories, as if the value of existence were measured by the number of external impressions, and as if the more you are in motion, the more alive you seem to be. And against this background, home begins to look like a pause, like a stop, like something secondary, like a place where you only recover in order to go back out into real life again. And if you honestly say that you truly feel good at home, people look at you strangely, as if you are afraid of something, as if you are missing something, as if you are not really living. But let us stop for a second. What is home? Not as a place, but as a state. Home is perhaps the only place where almost nothing is demanded of you, where you do not have to be interesting, do not have to keep a conversation going, do not have to match anything, and do not have to hold your face. In a world that is more and more turning into a stage, home remains the last backstage area. There you can be tired, silent, awkward, unproductive, and simply be. And perhaps that is exactly why so many people are drawn there. Because external life has become too noisy, too judging, too demanding, too much like an endless performance. Every day we have to be someone somewhere, a good worker, a normal person, an interesting interlocutor, and all of this is a form of small but constant tension. And at some point, a very simple desire appears in a person to stop playing. To stay at home is sometimes not about doing nothing. It is about not pretending. There is a huge difference. Many people think that those who love to stay at home are simply afraid of the world. And sometimes that is true, but very often it is not. Very often these are people who have been among people for too long, who have given too much, talked too much, and held themselves together for too long. And at some point the psyche simply says, enough. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is a space where you begin to hear yourself again. But society does not tolerate silence well. It confuses it with stagnation, with emptiness, with the absence of life. Because we live in a culture that mostly values what is visible. If you did not go anywhere, it is as if nothing happened, and if you do not have a story, it is as if you do not have a life. But real life does not happen only where there are witnesses. Sometimes it happens exactly where there are none. Inside, in the pause, in the slowing down. There are people for whom home is not a refuge from life, but a place where life stops being a performance, a place where you do not have to be interesting, convenient, full of energy, or in shape. And perhaps this is not weakness. Perhaps this is a form of taking care of yourself. Because constantly being outside is exhausting. Because it requires you to always react to something, to adapt to someone, to keep your face, to control yourself, to stay within invisible rules, and to be normal, even when you are tired, even when you are empty inside, even when you just want to stop. And if a person says, I feel good at home, this does not always mean, I am afraid. Sometimes it means that they are tired, overloaded, and need at least one place where nobody is judging them. But the world rarely hears it like that. The world hears that this person is boring, that this person is closed off, that there is something wrong with them. Because in a culture of eternal movement, any stop always looks suspicious. And still, if we are honest, a love for home is not always the same thing. Sometimes it really is a choice of silence, a choice of a space where you do not have to play a role, a choice of a place where you can slowly gather yourself back together. And sometimes it is not quite a choice. Sometimes it is something quieter and more unnoticeable, not a decision, not a conviction, but rather a relief. The relief that you do not have to go anywhere, do not have to meet anyone, and do not have to put your face on again. And here the boundary becomes almost indistinguishable. From the outside, everything looks the same. A person just likes to stay at home. They are calm, they do not bother anyone, and they do not explain anything. But inside, these can be very different states. In one case, it is fullness. In the other, it is contraction. In one, it is a silence that has breathing in it. In the other, It is a silence in which someone is hiding. And perhaps the most honest question here does not sound like, "Why do you like staying at home?" It sounds like, "What do you feel when you think about going out?" Is it calm, a light tiredness? Or is it tension, tightness, and the desire to stay where it is safe? Because sometimes we return home in order to recover, and sometimes in order not to face things. And from this point on, the conversation becomes completely different. Not about home, but about fear. Because sometimes we return home to recover, and sometimes to avoid facing things. And here the conversation stops being abstract, because it is no longer about personality or lifestyle. It is about fear, about the place inside where you choose not just home but safety, not just silence but control, not just peace but the absence of risk. Home is predictable. Everything is in its place. You know what awaits you. You know who you will be there. You do not have to improvise, adapt, or explain yourself. While the world outside is uncertainty, people, random conversations, awkward pauses, other people's expectations, and looks in which it is unclear whether you are being accepted or evaluated. And if we are honest, all of this is exhausting, sometimes so much that the very thought of going somewhere already feels like overload. And here it is easy to confuse two things: being tired of the world and being afraid of it, because fatigue says, "I need to recover and then I will come back." And fear says, "It is better not to go out at all." But from the inside, they feel almost the same. In both cases, you want to stay. In both, there is silence. In both, it feels safer. That is why it is so easy to live for years thinking that you are just that kind of person, an introvert, a homebody, not about noise, not about groups. And sometimes that is true, but sometimes it is just a careful name for avoidance. Because being with people is a risk. The risk of not being liked, of being misunderstood, of seeming awkward, of getting tired, of being unnecessary. And home is the place where these risks almost disappear, where you do not have to go through small social trials, do not have to enter into contact again, do not have to be seen again. And here a very unpleasant thought appears. What if you love being at home not because you feel good there, but because outside you feel anxious, not in a dramatic way, not as panic, but as a quiet background tension, as an expectation that it will be hard, as a desire not to add one more burden to yourself. And then, "I just love being at home," becomes not a description of taste, but a description of a strategy of not overloading yourself, of not getting into situations where you have to represent something, of not risking being unnecessary. And this is very human. There is nothing shameful in it, but there is one danger. The world begins to shrink. First, you just stay at home more often. Then you agree to meetings less often. Then you have fewer and fewer places where you feel normal. And at some point, the whole world fits into a few rooms. And from the inside, this still looks like calm. But sometimes it is not peace. Sometimes it is simply the absence of movement. So here is a very simple and very honest question. Do you stay at home because you feel good there, or because it is easier there? Because good is about fullness and easier is about avoidance, and sometimes they coincide, but very often they do not. And here you have to be careful with beautiful explanations, because sometimes "I am an introvert" is true. And sometimes it is just a convenient story not to ask yourself harder questions, since admitting "I am afraid" is much harder than saying "I am just comfortable like this." There is one more subtle point. Home gives a feeling of control. Outside there is unpredictability. People, circumstances, accidents. And at home, everything is known, familiar, and under control. And if there is a lot of anxiety inside, the psyche naturally reaches for the place where everything can be predicted. But life in a place where everything is always predictable becomes very narrow over time. You can be safe and at the same time stop growing. So here is perhaps the most honest test. If you knew that outside it would not be awkward, not hard, not exhausting, would you still prefer to stay at home? Because if yes, perhaps this is your true nature, and if no, perhaps this is not about a love for home. And here comes one more unpleasant thought. From the inside, peace and avoidance feel almost the same. In both there is silence. In both there are fewer stimuli. In both it feels simpler, and only the consequences show the difference. Peace makes you more alive. Avoidance makes your world smaller. Peace gives depth. Avoidance gives contraction. And the problem is that contraction happens very slowly, almost imperceptibly, over years, so slowly that you can honestly think you are just living like this. And then one day you notice that you almost never go out, almost never try, almost never take risks, almost never face things. So the most important question of this part is simple. Are you choosing home, or are you choosing not to face the world? Because the difference between peace and avoidance does not become visible right away. It becomes visible in what your world turns into. If home is a place where you recover, your world becomes bigger over time. If home is a place where you hide, your world begins to shrink. And here a very simple but very honest criterion appears. Is your life expanding, or is it narrowing? A healthy home is not a cage. It is a base. It is a place you return to in order to go out again. It is a space where you can be yourself, gather yourself, recover, and then meet the world again. Home as strength is not a refusal of life. It is support for life. But home as a shelter is something completely different. It is a place where it is safe, where you do not have to explain yourself, where you do not have to take risks, where you do not have to be seen. And if we are honest, all of us sometimes need this. The problem does not begin when you love being at home. The problem begins when home becomes the only place where you live. Because life, by its nature, happens outside. Meetings, attempts, mistakes, awkwardness, uncertainty, all the things you want to hide from, and which, paradoxically, are exactly what create the feeling that you are alive. If you keep coming home in order to recover, that is healthy. If you keep coming home in order not to face things, that is a warning sign. And the difference between these two can be felt very physically. When you think about going out, what appears inside? Light tiredness, or tightness and the desire to stay. Because fear always contracts, and peace expands. There are people who are truly quieter by nature. They do not need much contact. They do not need much noise. They do not need to be in the center. Their way of living is deeper, slower, calmer. And there is nothing wrong with that. The problem begins when behind, "I am just this kind of person," hides a life with too many things that never happened. Conversations that never happened. Attempts that never happened. Meetings that never happened. Versions of yourself that never happened. And then home stops being home. It becomes a border. There is one more very important thing. When you live in avoidance, it almost always seems to you that you are taking care of yourself. That you are not overloading. That you are choosing calm. But over the long run, this often turns not into care, but into the shrinking of life. The world becomes smaller, narrower, safer, poorer. And this happens so slowly that you can go for a long time without noticing that you are no longer living. You are just maintaining comfort. There is one very simple and very honest question that can clarify a lot. If fear disappeared from your life, would you still live the same way? If yes, perhaps you have really found your rhythm. If no, perhaps this is not a love for home, but a life built around avoidance. And this is not an accusation. It is just a point of honesty. Because nobody is obliged to be an extrovert. Nobody is obliged to love noise. Nobody is obliged to want to go somewhere. But every person, one way or another, is obliged to live. Not to exist, not to survive, but to live. And life is always a little bit of risk, a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of awkwardness, a little bit of stepping beyond what is familiar. Home should not be a place where you disappear. Home should be a place from which you return to the world. And perhaps the most accurate criterion sounds like this. After you have been at home, do you want to live more or less? If more, this is your home. If less, perhaps this is not a home, but a shelter. Loving to be at home is not weakness. Weakness is making home the only place where you allow yourself to exist. And perhaps real maturity is not choosing between home and the world, but learning to use home as a point of support, not as a border, so that there is somewhere to return to and somewhere to go out to.